There's a moment that happens in the space between hearing kind words and knowing what to do with them. Someone tells you that you did something well, that you look beautiful, that your work mattered, and before you can even register the warmth of it, something inside you moves to push it away. "Oh, it was nothing," you hear yourself say, or "I just got lucky," or "anyone could have done it," or even just a quick, uncomfortable laugh that deflects the attention, like light bouncing off a mirror. You've felt this, haven't you? That strange automatic reflex that makes receiving a compliment feel almost more difficult than criticism. That quiet discomfort that rises in your chest when someone sees something good in you that you're not sure you're allowed to claim. And maybe you've wondered why. Why does kindness sometimes feel harder to hold than harshness? Why does praise create a kind of panic that leaves you scrambling for ways to diminish yourself, to redirect, to make the moment pass as quickly as possible? If you've ever felt this, if you've ever noticed yourself shrinking in the face of someone's appreciation, you're not alone in this experience. And tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we're going to explore this together, gently, with compassion, because there's so much more to understand about why some of us find it so difficult to let good things in. Now, dim those lights, get cozy, settle into your pillow, and let yourself relax. Take a breath. I'll write the complete script for you now. This will be one continuous flowing narration from segments 125 plus the outro, with no section breaks, titles, or numbers, just pure script text ready for voiceover. The reflex happens so quickly, you might not even notice it anymore. Someone offers you praise, and before their words have fully landed, you're already constructing your defense. "Oh, this old thing," or "I really should have done better," or "it was mostly luck." The deflection is so smooth, so practiced that it feels like breathing. But here's what's happening beneath the surface. Your nervous system is treating the compliment not as a gift but as a threat. Because somewhere deep in your psychological wiring, being seen in a positive light triggers the same alarm bells as being exposed, as being visible in a way that feels dangerous. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between how someone sees you and how you see yourself. And that tension, that gap between their perception and your internal reality, creates a kind of friction in your mind. It's like two incompatible pieces of information trying to exist in the same space. They say you're talented, you believe you're average, they say you're beautiful, you see only flaws, they say you made a difference, you think anyone could have done it. And when these two narratives collide, something has to give. So you automatically reach for the explanation that maintains your existing self-concept, even if it means rejecting kindness, even if it means pushing away something that could actually nourish you. This automatic deflection isn't a choice you're making consciously. It's a script that's running in the background of your mind, written long ago and now playing on repeat. You might not even realize you're doing it until someone points it out, until a friend says gently, "Why can't you just say thank you?" And even then, the explanation feels just out of reach. It's not that you don't want to accept their words, it's that something deeper won't let you. Something inside believes that accepting praise would be dishonest, or dangerous, or would set you up for disappointment. So you deflect, you redirect, you minimize, and the compliment floats away like smoke, never quite touching the part of you that needed to hear it. The pattern shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. In professional settings when your work is praised, in personal moments when someone admires something about you, in casual conversations when a friend mentions something you did well. The response is always the same: immediate discomfort, quick deflection, return to safety. And what's interesting is that this deflection often comes wrapped in what looks like humility or modesty. It can appear as though you're just being gracious, as though you're avoiding arrogance. But underneath, it's something else entirely. It's a protective mechanism, a way of staying small enough to avoid being knocked down, of managing expectations, of controlling how you're perceived. Because if you never claim your strengths, they can never be questioned. If you never acknowledge your worth, you can never be devastated when someone challenges it. And so, the deflection becomes a kind of armor, a way of moving through the world that feels safe, even as it keeps you separate from the very connection and affirmation you might be craving. Because here's the paradox: the same people who can't accept compliments are often the ones who most need to hear them, who carry the deepest doubts about their own value, who would benefit most from letting kind words actually land. But the armor is so well constructed, so automatic, that even when someone tries to reach you with their appreciation, it bounces off before it can penetrate. And you're left still hungry, still unsure, still believing the old stories about yourself that may never have been true in the first place. Long before you learned to deflect compliments, you learned something else entirely. You learned a story about who you are and what you deserve. Maybe this story was written in small moments, in the times your achievements were met with silence instead of celebration, or when your excitement was deemed too much, your needs too demanding. Attachment theorist John Bowlby understood that our earliest relationships don't just teach us about others, they teach us about ourselves. And if those early mirrors reflected back that you were only valuable when you were useful, only lovable when you were perfect, only deserving when you earned it, then praise becomes confusing. Because the praise doesn't match the blueprint. It doesn't align with the fundamental understanding of yourself that was formed in those early years, when your brain was most impressionable, when you were learning not just facts about the world, but truths about your place in it. If the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally only showed approval when you performed well, when you stayed quiet, when you didn't make waves, then you internalized a very specific equation. Your worth equals your output. Your value is conditional. Your lovability must be earned again and again and again. And when someone offers you a compliment that doesn't require you to have earned it, that simply acknowledges something inherent about you. Your kindness, your presence, your being. Your psyche doesn't know what to do with it. It's like receiving a gift in a currency you don't recognize. The compliment might be genuine, but it doesn't compute within the economic system of worth you've been operating under your whole life. So you reject it, not because you want to, but because you don't have a place to put it in the architecture of how you understand yourself and your value. This architecture was built brick by brick, often without you even realizing it. Maybe it was built in the moments when your parents' face lit up only when you brought home perfect grades. Maybe it was built in the times when your creativity was dismissed as impractical, when your sensitivity was labelled as weakness, when your needs were treated as burdens. Maybe it was built in a household where love felt scarce, where approval had to be competed for, where attention was only granted to the loudest or the most accomplished or the least troublesome. And each of these experiences added another layer to the structure, another reinforcement to the belief that you are only as good as what you can provide, only as worthy as what you can achieve, only as deserving as the ways you can make yourself useful or impressive or invisible, depending on what was required. Developmental psychologists understand that these early relational patterns become internalized working models, mental blueprints that shape how we see ourselves and others throughout our lives. If your early experiences taught you that you had to earn love, then unconditional positive regard, even in the form of a simple compliment, feels suspicious. It feels like a trick. It feels like someone hasn't yet seen the real you, the flawed you, the you that doesn't deserve such kindness. And this is why deflecting compliments isn't really about the compliment at all. It's about a much deeper wound, a foundational belief about your own unworthiness that was installed before you had the language to question it, before you had the capacity to understand that the treatment you received wasn't a reflection of your value, but a reflection of someone else's limitations, pain, or inability to love well. There's something profoundly vulnerable about being truly seen, not just noticed, but witnessed in your goodness, in your capability, in your worth. When someone offers you a genuine compliment, they're saying, "I see you. I see this beautiful thing about you." And for many people, that level of visibility feels almost unbearable. It's not modesty, it's not humility, it's a deep-seated fear of being fully known. Because what if they're wrong? What if they see something in you that isn't really there, and eventually they'll discover the truth? Or worse, what if they're right, and now you have to live up to that image? Psychologist Carl Rogers wrote about the gap between our real self and our ideal self. He understood that psychological distress often comes from the distance between who we actually are and who we think we should be. And compliments can widen that gap uncomfortably. When someone praises a quality you don't believe you possess, or praises you for an achievement you feel was inadequate, their words highlight the discrepancy between their perception and your internal experience, and that discrepancy is painful. It makes you feel like an imposter, like you're deceiving them simply by existing in their presence without correcting their mistaken belief about you. So you rush to correct it. You deflect the compliment not to be modest, but to maintain what feels like honesty, to close that uncomfortable gap between how they see you and how you see yourself. But what if the gap isn't where you think it is? What if your self-perception is the distorted one, shaped by years of criticism, comparison, and conditional acceptance? What if their compliment is actually more accurate than your own internal assessment? This is the territory where things get complex, where you realize that your resistance to compliments isn't protecting truth. It's protecting a familiar story. Even if that story is painful, even if that story is keeping you small, and there's something else happening in that moment of visibility. When someone sees you, really sees you, there's an intimacy to it that can feel overwhelming. Intimacy isn't just about physical closeness or romantic connection. It's about being known. And being known means being vulnerable to judgment, to rejection, to the possibility that once someone truly sees you, they might not like what they find. So you preemptively manage that risk by controlling what they're allowed to see, by deflecting their positive observations, by keeping yourself slightly obscured. It's safer to be partially visible than to be fully seen and potentially found lacking. This fear of full visibility often has roots in early experiences of being seen and then hurt. Maybe you showed excitement and were told you were being too much. Maybe you expressed pride in an accomplishment and were accused of bragging. Maybe you revealed a vulnerability and it was used against you later. These experiences teach you that visibility is dangerous, that showing your full self invites pain. So you learn to stay partially hidden, to keep parts of yourself protected, to deflect attention even when that attention is positive. because positive attention is still attention, and attention still feels like risk. And what's particularly painful is that this protective mechanism ends up isolating you from the very connection you crave. When you can't receive someone's compliment, you're also blocking the connection they're trying to create with you. Their praise is an offering, a bridge they're building toward you, and when you deflect it, you're essentially saying, I can't meet you on that bridge, I can't let you see me the way you're seeing me, I need you to see me the way I see myself, even if that view is harsher, even if it's less true. And so the moment of potential connection becomes instead a moment of disconnection, a missed opportunity for being truly met by another person. Listen closely to the words you use when you deflect a compliment. Whose voice are you really hearing? Often, the critical inner dialogue that prevents us from accepting praise isn't originally ours at all. It's an internalized echo of someone who once held power over our sense of self. Perhaps a parent who believed that praise would make you arrogant, or a teacher who only pointed out mistakes, or a culture that taught you that self-effacement was a virtue. Developmental psychology shows us that children internalize the voices of their caregivers, and these voices become the lens through which they see themselves for years, sometimes decades to come. This internalization happens automatically, effortlessly, inevitably. As a child, you don't have the cognitive capacity to critically evaluate whether the messages you're receiving about yourself are accurate or fair. You simply absorb them as truth. If a parent repeatedly suggests that you're not quite good enough, that becomes your baseline understanding of yourself. If a teacher implies that your best efforts are mediocre, you internalize mediocrity as your ceiling. If your peers mock your enthusiasm or your appearance or your interests, you learn to see yourself through the lens of their mockery. And these voices, once internalized, become extraordinarily persistent. They become the narrator of your inner life, the constant commentary that evaluates everything you do, everything you are. And the cruelest part is that you might not even recognize these voices as external anymore. They've become so integrated into your sense of self that they feel like your own thoughts, your own judgments, your own truth. When you deflect a compliment, you might think you're just being realistic, just being honest about your limitations. But listen more closely. Is that your voice, or is it your father's voice, telling you that pride comes before a fall? Is it your perspective, or your mother's anxiety about you becoming conceited? Is it your assessment, or your childhood bully's taunt that you've never quite shaken? Psychoanalytic theory, particularly the work of Sigmund Freud and later object relations theorists, explores how we internalize not just voices but entire relational patterns. We take in not only what people said to us but how they related to us, how they made us feel about ourselves. And these internalized objects, as they're called in the theory, continue to influence our self-concept long after the original relationships have changed or ended. You might be 40 years old, living thousands of miles from the parent who raised you, and still operating under the psychological rules they installed when you were 6. Still deflecting compliments because somewhere deep inside, a voice that sounds like yours but isn't originally yours, whispers that accepting praise is dangerous, is foolish, is setting yourself up for disappointment. The process of differentiating your authentic voice from these internalized voices is part of what psychotherapy often addresses. It's the slow, sometimes painful work of asking yourself, is this actually true, or is this something I was taught to believe? Of questioning the automatic assumptions that have guided your self-perception for so long. of recognizing that just because a belief about yourself feels true doesn't mean it is true. It might just be familiar. It might just be old. It might just be a recording that's been playing so long you forgot you could turn it off. And what makes this particularly complex is that sometimes these internalized voices had good intentions. Maybe your parent genuinely believed that keeping you humble would protect you from disappointment or from becoming entitled. Maybe your teacher thought constant criticism would motivate you to improve. Maybe your culture's emphasis on self-effacement came from a legitimate value of collective harmony over individual ego. The intentions might have been protective or cultural or well-meaning, but the impact is still the same. You learn to be suspicious of praise, to reflexively diminish yourself, to treat your own worth as something that must be constantly questioned and never fully claimed. And now, even when you want to accept a compliment, even when you rationally understand that the kind words someone is offering you are genuine and deserved, that old voice pipes up first, and it's louder than the compliment. It's more familiar, it's safer, so you listen to it instead. There's a beautiful quality in genuine humility, in recognizing that you're part of something larger than yourself, that your achievements don't make you superior to others. But somewhere along the way, many of us confused humility with self-erasure. We learned that taking up space was selfish, that acknowledging our strengths was arrogant, that accepting praise meant we were full of ourselves. Cultural psychologists have documented how different societies teach vastly different relationships with self-promotion and acceptance of praise. In many collectivist cultures, deflecting compliments is seen as a social grace, a way of maintaining harmony and showing respect. And there's wisdom in that cultural practice when it comes from a genuine place of humility, when it reflects a value system that prioritizes community over individual ego. But the problem arises when humility curdles into something else, when it stops being about perspective and starts being about shame, when it's no longer about recognizing your place in the larger web of humanity, but about making yourself smaller, lesser, unworthy of acknowledgement. This is the distinction that often gets lost. True humility doesn't require you to deny your strengths. It just asks that you hold them without arrogance, that you recognize gifts as gifts rather than as proof of superiority. But the version of humility many of us internalized isn't that balanced. It's a humility that demands you always be the smallest person in the room, that you never acknowledge what you're good at, that you treat your accomplishments as accidents or luck rather than as the result of effort, skill, or talent. This false humility isn't actually humble at all. It's a performance, a way of managing other people's perceptions, of trying to avoid triggering envy or resentment or the uncomfortable attention that comes with being seen as successful or capable or special in any way. And this performance is exhausting because it requires you to constantly monitor yourself, to police your own expressions of pride or satisfaction, to immediately counterbalance any positive statement about yourself with a negative one. You can't just say thank you when someone compliments your work. You have to add, but there are so many things I could have done better. You can't accept praise for your appearance without mentioning a flaw. You can't acknowledge a success without attributing it to external factors beyond your control. The humility becomes a kind of self-flagellation, a constant reminder to yourself and others that you're not actually that good, not actually that capable, not actually deserving of the admiration being offered. Sociologist Irving Goffman wrote extensively about self-presentation and the social performances we engage in to manage how others perceive us. And deflecting compliments is absolutely a form of impression management. You're managing the impression that you're not arrogant, not full of yourself, not someone who thinks too highly of themselves. But in doing so, you're also managing yourself right out of receiving the validation, connection, and acknowledgement that could actually nourish you. You're sacrificing your own emotional needs on the altar of how you think you should appear to others. And here's what's particularly insidious about this pattern. It often doesn't even achieve its intended goal. People don't necessarily think better of you for deflecting their compliments. In fact, it can have the opposite effect. It can make them feel dismissed, as if their perception isn't valued, as if their attempt to connect with you through appreciation has been rejected. It can create a subtle barrier in the relationship, a sense that you're not quite reachable, not quite willing to receive what they're trying to give. So the performance of humility ends up isolating you in the very social context it was meant to navigate smoothly. What would it look like instead to accept a compliment with genuine humility? Perhaps it would sound like a simple, warm thank you that acknowledges both the kindness of the other person and the truth of what they're saying. Perhaps it would look like allowing yourself to feel a moment of pride or satisfaction without immediately rushing to diminish it. Perhaps it would feel like recognizing that accepting praise for something you did well doesn't mean you're claiming to be perfect or superior or beyond criticism. It just means you're acknowledging reality. You did something worth acknowledging, someone noticed, and you can hold that truth with grace, with gratitude, without arrogance, but also without the false modesty that ultimately serves no one, least of all yourself. Here's what happens in the quiet calculations of your mind when someone praises you. You immediately start worrying about the future. If you accept this compliment, if you acknowledge that you did something well, then next time the bar will be higher. People will expect more. And what if you can't deliver? What if this moment of success was a fluke, and now you've set yourself up for inevitable disappointment? This is what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety, the fear of future failure that prevents you from enjoying present success. It's safer to downplay your achievements now than to risk falling short of raised expectations later. This anxiety lives in the future tense, constantly projecting forward, imagining scenarios where you're exposed as not being as good as this current moment suggests. And it's rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding about how achievement and growth work. It assumes that accepting praise means you're claiming to have reached a fixed, permanent level of competence that you'll now be expected to maintain flawlessly forever. But that's not how humans work. We're variable. We have good days and bad days. We succeed in some moments and struggle in others. Accepting a compliment about something you did well today doesn't obligate you to perform at that exact level for the rest of your life. But the anxious mind doesn't operate on that nuanced understanding. It operates on worst-case scenarios. It imagines accepting the compliment, then failing spectacularly next time, then being confronted with the discrepancy, then being exposed as a fraud who doesn't deserve the praise that was offered. So to avoid that entire imagined sequence of events, you simply deflect the initial compliment. You never accept the elevated position in the first place, so you can never fall from it. It's a preemptive strategy, a way of managing risk by refusing the potential reward. This pattern is particularly common in people with perfectionistic tendencies or high levels of performance anxiety. If your sense of worth is tied to consistently meeting, or exceeding expectations, then any raising of those expectations feels threatening. It's easier to keep the bar low, to be underestimated, because then you can exceed expectations without really trying. But if people start thinking highly of your capabilities, if they start expecting excellence, then the pressure intensifies. Every performance becomes a potential referendum on whether you're really as good as they think. Every project becomes laden with the weight of not disappointing people who believe in you. And what gets lost in this anxious calculation is the present moment. The moment where someone is genuinely appreciating you, where connection is being offered, where you could simply let yourself feel good about something you did. That moment gets sacrificed to a future that hasn't happened yet, to an imagined scenario of failure and exposure that exists only in your mind. You're robbing yourself of the joy and validation of the present to protect yourself from a potential pain in the future. And the cost of that trade-off is immense. You go through life never quite letting yourself enjoy your successes, never quite letting yourself believe you're capable, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. For the moment when you're revealed as not being as good as this brief achievement might suggest. Cognitive behavioral therapy addresses this kind of anticipatory anxiety by challenging the automatic thoughts that fuel it. And what evidence do you actually have that accepting this compliment will lead to unbearable pressure and eventual failure? What if accepting praise actually builds confidence that helps you perform better in the future, rather than creating pressure that makes you perform worse? What if other people's expectations are more flexible than you imagine, and they won't actually condemn you for being human, for having variation in your performance, for not being perfect all the time? But these rational challenges often struggle against the emotional intensity of the anxiety, because the fear isn't really about logic. It's about a deeper terror of being found insufficient, of being exposed as less than, of experiencing the shame of falling short. And that terror has roots that go deeper than the current moment, deeper than this particular compliment. It's connected to every time you were made to feel that your worth was conditional on your performance. Every time love or approval seemed to depend on your ability to achieve. Every time falling short felt like failing as a person, rather than simply experiencing a temporary setback. The anxiety about future expectations is ultimately anxiety about future abandonment, about the possibility that if you don't maintain an impossible standard, you'll lose the connection, the respect, the love you've been offered. There's a particular kind of psychological phenomenon that affects high-achieving people especially intensely. Psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes first identified it in 1978, calling it the imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. It's the persistent belief that your successes are due to luck, timing, or deceiving others into thinking you're more competent than you really are. When you live with this internal experience, every compliment feels like evidence that you've successfully fooled someone else, and the praise doesn't land as validation, it lands as pressure, because now you have to maintain the illusion. Now you have to keep pretending to be the person they think you are. The imposter phenomenon is particularly insidious because it exists independently of actual competence or achievement. You can be objectively skilled, talented, successful by any external measure, and still feel internally like a fraud. In fact, the phenomenon often intensifies with success. Each new achievement, instead of building confidence, becomes another data point proving how good you are at deceiving people. Each compliment becomes evidence of how thoroughly you've tricked someone into overestimating you. and the fear underneath is constant. Eventually someone will figure it out. Eventually you'll be exposed. Eventually the gap between who they think you are and who you know yourself to be will become too large to hide. This creates an exhausting double life. Externally you might appear confident, capable, accomplished. Internally you're constantly bracing for the moment of exposure, constantly feeling like you barely know what you're doing, constantly attributing your successes to anything other than your own ability. And when someone offers you a compliment, it triggers all of these internal contradictions. They're praising the external version of you, the competent one, the one they believe in. But you know the internal version, the one who feels uncertain, who questions every decision, who is convinced they've somehow managed to fool everyone around them into thinking they're more capable than they actually are. Research on imposter phenomenon shows that it's particularly common among high achievers, people who have actually demonstrated significant competence and success. It's also more prevalent in certain populations, including women, people of colour, first-generation professionals, anyone who occupies a space where they feel they don't quite belong, where they're aware of being different from the dominant group. This makes sense. When you're constantly aware that people like you aren't typically found in these spaces, it's easy to feel like your presence is an anomaly, like you somehow slipped through the cracks rather than genuinely earning your place. And the imposter phenomenon is self-reinforcing, because when you believe your success is fraudulent, you don't internalize evidence of your competence. Every successful project, every positive evaluation, every compliment, all of it gets filtered through the belief that you got lucky this time, or that people are being nice, or that they haven't yet figured out your limitations. So the evidence that should build confidence instead strengthens the fear of being discovered. And you become hyper-vigilant, over-preparing, working twice as hard as necessary to make sure you don't slip up, to make sure the facade doesn't crack, which paradoxically often leads to even more success, which creates even more internal dissonance because now you're even more convinced that you're fooling people at an even higher level. Breaking free from imposter phenomenon isn't about achieving more or finally getting enough external validation to convince yourself you're competent. It's about recognizing that the internal narrative, the one that says you're a fraud, isn't based on reality. It's based on distorted thinking patterns, on unrealistic standards, on comparing your messy internal experience to everyone else's polished external presentation. It's about learning to internalize your achievements, to recognize that luck and timing and support from others don't negate your own contribution, that being helped doesn't mean you didn't also help yourself, that learning as you go doesn't mean you're unqualified, it means you're growing. And it's about learning to tolerate the discomfort of being seen as competent even when you don't feel entirely certain. Because certainty is a myth. No one feels entirely confident all the time. The difference is that some people have learned to accept praise even in the midst of uncertainty, to say thank you even when they don't feel entirely deserving, to understand that being acknowledged for what you've accomplished doesn't mean you're claiming to be perfect or omniscient or beyond continued growth. It just means you're allowing yourself to be seen accurately, as someone who did something worth acknowledging, even if you're still learning, even if you could have done it better, even if you're not entirely sure how you pulled it off. Your brain has a negativity bias, an evolutionary adaptation that helped your ancestors survive by paying more attention to threats than to safety. But in modern life, this means your mind is extraordinarily skilled at cataloguing everything you did wrong and remarkably poor at registering what you did right. Neuropsychologist Rick Hanson describes this as the brain being like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. So when someone offers you a compliment, it doesn't stick. It slides right off because your attention is already focused on the 99 things you could have done better, the small mistakes no one else noticed, the ways you fell, short of your own impossible standards. This negativity bias made sense in an environment where missing a threat could mean death, where it was more important to remember where the predator attacked than where you found plentiful food. But in contemporary life, where most of our threats are social and psychological rather than physical, this same bias creates a distorted view of ourselves and our performance. You remember every awkward thing you said at a social gathering, but forget the moments of genuine connection. You fixate on the one critical comment in a sea of positive feedback. You replay your mistakes obsessively, while your successes barely register before fading from memory. And this isn't a character flaw. It's not that you're choosing to be negative or pessimistic. It's that your brain is wired with an asymmetry in how it processes positive versus negative information. Negative experiences are encoded more deeply, recalled more easily, weighted more heavily in your decision-making. They create stronger emotional responses and longer-lasting memories. While positive experiences, unless you consciously work to internalize them, often float by without leaving much of a trace. They feel good in the moment, but they don't fundamentally shift your self-concept the way negative experiences do. So when someone compliments you, the positive information they're offering has to compete with a well-established neural network of negative self-perception. And it's an uneven battle. The compliment is new, singular, maybe even a surprise, but the critical voice, the catalogue of your perceived failures and inadequacies that's been building for years, it has neural pathways worn deep through repetition. It has emotional weight accumulated over countless experiences, so of course the negative information wins. Of course you deflect the compliment and return to the familiar narrative about your shortcomings. It's not that the compliment isn't true, it's that it's fighting against decades of neural conditioning that prioritizes and remembers the negative. Rick Hanson's work focuses on what he calls taking in the good, deliberately working to counteract this negativity bias by consciously savoring positive experiences, by holding on to compliments and letting them sink in rather than immediately deflecting them. This isn't about toxic positivity or denying reality. It's about creating more balance in how you process information about yourself. Because the reality is that you are neither entirely good nor entirely bad, neither completely competent nor wholly inadequate. You're complex. You have strengths and weaknesses. You succeed in some areas and struggle in others. But if your brain is only registering and retaining the negative information, you end up with a fundamentally distorted self-concept, one that sees every flaw in high definition while your strengths appear blurry and questionable. This is why practicing receiving compliments is actually a form of neuroplasticity training. Every time you consciously choose to pause when someone praises you, to breathe, to let the words sink in before deflecting, you're working against decades of conditioning. You're creating new neural pathways that allow positive information to be encoded more deeply, to stick around longer, to have more weight in your self-concept. It feels awkward at first because you're working against deeply ingrained patterns. Your nervous system wants to return to the familiar loop of self-criticism, but with practice, with deliberate repetition, you can teach your brain that it's safe to hold on to the good. That accepting a compliment doesn't mean becoming arrogant or delusional, it means allowing your self-perception to reflect a more complete picture of who you are. And part of this practice involves catching yourself in the automatic thought patterns that dismiss positive feedback. When someone compliments you and your immediate internal response is, "They're just being nice," or "they don't really know me," or "they obviously didn't notice all the mistakes," pause. Notice that these thoughts are interpretations, not facts. Notice that your brain is actively working to discount the positive information being offered. And then, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it feels false, practice receiving the compliment. Let yourself consider, even for just a moment, that maybe they're being genuine. Maybe they do see something real. Maybe your work, your kindness, your presence really did make a positive impact. You don't have to fully believe it yet. You just have to create enough space to let the possibility exist alongside your doubt. Accepting a compliment requires something that might not be immediately obvious. It requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to open yourself to the possibility that someone's kind words might actually be true, which means you have to soften the armor you've built around your sense of self. Researcher Brené Brown has spent decades studying vulnerability, and one of her core findings is that vulnerability is not weakness, it's emotional courage. But when you've spent years protecting yourself from disappointment, from criticism, from the pain of not being enough, letting in positive feedback feels dangerous. It feels like lowering your defenses in the middle of a battle. Because here's what vulnerability means in this context. It means allowing yourself to hope that maybe you are actually capable, talented, worthy of admiration. And hope is terrifying when you've been hurt before. Hope means you have something to lose. If you never let yourself believe the compliment, you can't be devastated when someone later contradicts it. If you never accept that maybe you are good at something, you can't be crushed when you fail at it. The deflection is a form of self-protection, a way of managing the risk that comes with letting positive information in. Because positive information creates possibility, and possibility creates vulnerability, and vulnerability means you might get hurt. Brené Brown talks about vulnerability as the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. But it's also, she notes, the source of fear, shame, and our struggle for worthiness. When you open yourself to one, you open yourself to the other. When you allow yourself to receive a compliment, to believe that someone sees something valuable in you, you're also opening yourself to the fear that they might be wrong, that you might disappoint them, that you might lose their good opinion. And that feels incredibly risky, especially if your sense of worth is already fragile, if you've experienced the pain of being loved conditionally, if you've learned that people's perceptions of you can shift suddenly and devastatingly. So you armor up. You keep yourself safe by keeping yourself small, by never quite claiming the good things people see in you, by maintaining an internal distance from their praise. And this armor works, in a sense. It does protect you from certain kinds of pain, but it also keeps you isolated from genuine connection, from the warmth of being truly seen and appreciated, from the possibility of building a self-concept that includes your strengths alongside your limitations. The armor keeps you safe, but it also keeps you alone, watching from behind a wall while connection and affirmation happen just out of reach. And what's particularly painful about this dynamic is that the people offering you compliments are often trying to create connection. They're not just making observations about you, they're reaching toward you, offering you a moment of intimacy, of shared positive regard. When they say, "You did this beautifully," or "You have such a kind heart," or "I admire how you handled that," they're saying, "I see you, and what I see matters to me, and I want you to know that I notice these good things about you." It's an offering of care. And when you deflect it, you're not just dismissing information, you're declining the connection, pushing away the hand being extended toward you. This creates a painful paradox for people who struggle with compliments. Often they're the same people who desperately want to feel seen, valued, loved. They want connection. They want to matter to others. But when someone tries to show them that they do matter, that they are seen, that they are valued, the armor goes up automatically. The deflection happens before the connection can be made, and so they end up perpetually hungry for the very thing they keep refusing when it's offered. Not because they don't want it, but because wanting it and receiving it are two different things, and receiving it requires a vulnerability they're not sure they can survive. Learning to receive compliments, then, is really learning to tolerate vulnerability. It's learning to stay present in the discomfort of being seen positively, of allowing someone else's perception to possibly be true, of holding hope alongside fear. It's practicing saying thank you, even when everything in you wants to deflect. It's breathing through the wave of discomfort that rises when you choose not to minimize yourself. It's recognizing that the temporary vulnerability of receiving a compliment is less costly than the ongoing isolation of never letting one land. And it's trusting, even without full certainty, that you're capable of handling whatever comes after the compliment, whether that's raised expectations or continued visibility, or even eventual disappointment. That you are resilient enough to survive being seen as capable, and then sometimes falling short. That your worth isn't actually dependent on maintaining a perfect performance, and therefore accepting acknowledgement for a good performance doesn't trap you into impossible standards, it just allows you to receive the connection being offered in that moment. Sometimes the inability to accept compliments isn't just about self-doubt, it's about shame, and shame is different from guilt. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. When shame lives at your core, when you carry a fundamental belief that there's something wrong with you, something broken or unworthy or defective, then compliments don't compute. They can't penetrate the wall of unworthiness, because that wall isn't about what you do, it's about who you are. Psychologist John Bradshaw called this toxic shame, the internalized belief that you're fundamentally flawed, and when you believe that at your deepest level, kind words from others feel like lies. Shame operates at a level deeper than conscious thought. It's not a rational assessment of yourself based on evidence. It's a felt sense, often encoded in the body, that you're inherently defective. This kind of core shame usually develops in childhood, in environments where you experienced consistent messages that you were too much or not enough, where your existence felt like a burden, where love and acceptance seemed fundamentally unavailable to someone like you. Maybe you grew up in a household with addiction, with mental illness, with violence, where the chaos felt like it was somehow your fault. Maybe you were abused, and the violation taught you that you must be fundamentally worthless to be treated that way. Maybe you simply existed in a family system where there was no room for who you actually were, and you learned that your true self was unacceptable. This shame gets internalized at such a fundamental level that it shapes your entire orientation toward yourself and the world. It becomes the lens through which every experience is filtered. When someone compliments you, shame immediately translates their words into evidence of how thoroughly you've deceived them, how if they really knew you, they would see the truth of your badness. The compliment doesn't challenge the shame, it reinforces it, because now you have proof that you're successfully hiding your defective self from others, which just makes you feel more fraudulent, more ashamed. Shame is particularly resistant to rational challenge because it doesn't live in the rational mind. It lives in a pre-verbal emotional space, often formed before you had language to describe it, before you had the cognitive capacity to question it. You can know intellectually that you're not fundamentally flawed, that you have value, that you deserve kindness. But shame doesn't care about what you know intellectually. It operates from a deeper place, from the body's memory of early experiences, from the nervous system's encoding of whether you are fundamentally safe or fundamentally wrong. Healing from toxic shame, then, requires more than cognitive work, though that's part of it. It requires embodied practices, relationships that consistently show you a different reflection of yourself than the one shame provides, experiences of being truly seen, including your vulnerabilities, and being accepted anyway. It requires what psychologist Judith Herman calls remembered connection, the experience of having your humanity recognized and affirmed consistently enough that it begins to challenge the shame's narrative. And it requires immense compassion, both from others and from yourself, because shame thrives in isolation and secrecy, and it begins to lose its grip when it's brought into the light, when it's met with gentleness rather than judgment. When you carry toxic shame, learning to accept a compliment isn't just about developing better self-esteem. It's about fundamentally revising your understanding of your own worth, about questioning a narrative so deep and old that it feels like truth itself, and that's extraordinarily difficult work. It means sitting with the discomfort of cognitive dissonance between the shame's message that you're fundamentally bad and the compliment's message that you did something good, you are something good. It means slowly, painfully, learning to tolerate the possibility that maybe the shame is wrong. Maybe the voice that's told you for years that you're defective has been lying. Maybe you are actually worthy of the kindness being offered. And here's what makes this particularly complex. Shame often masquerades as humility or realism. It tells you that recognizing your flaws, that staying aware of your inadequacies, is just being honest. But there's a difference between honest self-assessment and shame-based self-attack. Honest self-assessment can acknowledge both strengths and limitations. Shame only allows you to see the limitations. Honest self-assessment allows for growth and change. Shame insists you're fundamentally, unchangeably flawed. Honest self-assessment would allow a compliment to land as information. Shame treats every compliment as evidence that you've successfully hidden your true, terrible self. The path out of this begins with recognition, recognizing that this resistance to compliments might not just be modesty or self-doubt, but something deeper, something more painful. Recognizing that shame is a visitor, not your identity, even though it's taken up residence in your self-concept. Recognizing that you deserved better than the experiences that taught you to be ashamed of your own existence. And then gently beginning to practice a different relationship with yourself. Maybe that starts with simply noticing when shame speaks up, without immediately believing it. Maybe it continues with slowly allowing compliments to exist alongside shame's voice, even if you can't fully believe them yet. Maybe it grows through relationships where you risk being truly seen, vulnerabilities and all, and discover that you're met with compassion, rather than the rejection shame promised would come. In a world obsessed with comparison, many people have learned to measure their worth by looking sideways at others instead of inward at themselves. Social comparison theory, developed by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1954, suggests that people determine their own worth based on how they stack up against others. So when someone compliments you, your mind immediately starts calculating. But Sarah did it better. But Mark has achieved more. But compared to what I see online, this is nothing. The compliment gets filtered through an endless measuring tape, and it can never quite measure up because there's always someone who seems to be doing more, being more, achieving more. This constant comparison is exhausting, and it's also fundamentally flawed, because you're comparing your complete reality, including all your struggles, doubts, and behind-the-scenes chaos, to everyone else's carefully curated highlights. You see other people's finished products, their successes, their polished presentations, and you measure that against your messy process, your failures, your internal experience of barely holding it together. It's an inherently unfair comparison, but your mind does it automatically, constantly, relentlessly. And social media has amplified this tendency exponentially. You're no longer just comparing yourself to the people in your immediate environment, you're comparing yourself to the entire world's highlight reel. Someone is always doing something more impressive, achieving something greater, looking more beautiful, living more fully. The comparison is infinite, and the measuring never ends with a favourable result for you. Because the standard keeps moving, the competition keeps expanding, and you're always finding someone who makes your own achievements feel small by comparison. So when someone compliments you on something you did, your mind immediately searches for the counterexample. Someone who did it better, someone who did it more easily, someone whose version of this achievement is so far beyond yours that accepting a compliment for your version feels almost embarrassing. The compliment might be genuine, but to accept, it feels like admitting you're satisfied with something mediocre, something less than what someone else has achieved. And if you've internalized the message that your worth is determined by how you rank against others, then accepting a compliment for anything less than first place feels like accepting inadequacy. This measuring mindset creates a particular kind of suffering, because it means you can never fully enjoy your own accomplishments. Every success is immediately diminished by awareness of someone else's greater success. Every strength is overshadowed by someone else's superior strength. You live in a constant state of not enoughness, not because you're actually lacking, but because you're using an impossible standard that requires you to be the best at everything, better than everyone, before you're allowed to acknowledge something good about yourself. And the cruelest part is that this standard is unattainable. Even if you became the absolute best at one thing, there would be countless other things where someone else exceeds you. Even if you achieved extraordinary success, there would always be someone whose success looks more effortless, more impressive, more worthy of admiration. The measuring never concludes with enough. It only ever confirms not enough, because the measuring itself is the problem, not your actual performance or worth. Breaking free from the comparison trap doesn't mean pretending other people don't exist or that excellence doesn't matter. It means recognizing that worth isn't a competitive sport, that someone else's success doesn't diminish yours, that you can admire others' achievements without using them as evidence of your own inadequacy. It means learning to measure yourself against your own growth, your own values, your own journey, rather than against everyone else's seemingly perfect lives. And it means practicing receiving compliments as information about your specific impact in a specific moment, rather than as a statement about your rank in some imaginary hierarchy. When someone says you did this well, they're not saying you did this better than everyone else. They're saying what you did had value, had impact, mattered. And that can be true regardless of whether someone else could have done it differently or better. Your contribution doesn't have to be the most impressive contribution in the world to be worthy of acknowledgement. Your kindness doesn't have to exceed everyone else's kindness to be real and valuable. Your achievement doesn't have to break records to deserve recognition. But when you're trapped in comparison, none of this registers. The compliment just becomes another opportunity to confirm that you don't measure up, another piece of evidence that you're not enough. And so you deflect it, and you return to the measuring, and the cycle continues, leaving you perpetually hungry for validation you can never quite accept when it's offered. There's a strange comfort in self-diminishment. When you make yourself small, when you downplay your strengths and deflect praise, you protect yourself from a particular kind of vulnerability. The vulnerability of being tall enough to be knocked down. If you never claim your achievements, no one can take them away. If you never acknowledge your worth, you can't be devastated when someone questions it. This is what psychologists call a protective strategy, a way of managing the unpredictability of other people's perceptions and reactions. And it makes sense. If you've been hurt before by being too visible, too confident, too proud, then staying small becomes a form of armor. Maybe you learned this protection early. Maybe you had a sibling who couldn't tolerate your success, who punished you with cruelty or withdrawal whenever you achieved something they hadn't. Maybe you had a parent whose own insecurity meant they needed to cut you down whenever you rose up, to remind you not to get too big for your britches, not to think too highly of yourself. Maybe you experience tall poppy syndrome, the phenomenon where people who stand out are criticized or attacked simply for being exceptional. Whatever the specific experiences, the lesson was clear. Visibility is dangerous. Standing tall makes you a target, so you learn to crouch, to hide, to make yourself smaller and less threatening and less visible. And this protection worked in its way. When you stayed small, you avoided certain kinds of conflict. You didn't trigger other people's envy or insecurity. You didn't invite the criticism that comes with claiming your space. You flew under the radar, safe from the attacks that you witnessed happening to people who dared to be proud, who dared to acknowledge their own excellence. So staying small became a survival strategy, a way of navigating an environment that felt hostile to your growth, your success, your bigness. But what was once protection has become a prison. The strategy that kept you safe in one context is now keeping you isolated in another. You're no longer in that childhood home where your achievements were threatening. You're no longer surrounded by people who can't tolerate your success. But the pattern remains, the automatic crouching, the reflexive self-diminishment, the deflection of any compliment that might make you visible, might make you tall enough to be noticed. And so you stay small, even when staying small is no longer necessary, even when the people around you are genuinely trying to celebrate you, to acknowledge you, to support your growth. There's a particular grief in recognizing this pattern, in realizing how much of your life you've spent making yourself smaller than you are, how many compliments you've deflected that could have nourished you, how many achievements you've minimized that deserve to be celebrated, how many times you've hidden your light to make others comfortable, to avoid conflict, to stay safe from attacks that aren't even coming anymore. The protection made sense once. It was intelligent, adaptive, necessary. But it's outlived its usefulness, and now it's costing you more than it's protecting. And here's the particularly painful paradox. By staying small to avoid being knocked down, you're doing the knocking down yourself. You're preemptively diminishing yourself, criticizing yourself, cutting yourself down before anyone else gets the chance. You've internalized the attacker. You've become the one who can't tolerate your own success, who has to immediately minimize any achievement, who treats your own visibility as a threat that must be managed. You're protecting yourself from external attack by mounting an internal one. The path towards something different requires risk. It requires slowly, tentatively, allowing yourself to stand at your full height, even though it feels terrifying. It requires practicing receiving compliments without immediately deflecting, even though every instinct is screaming at you to make yourself small again. It requires challenging the belief that being seen is inherently dangerous, that claiming your worth makes you a target, that staying small is the only way to stay safe. And it requires building new evidence that maybe, just maybe, you can be visible and be safe, that you can acknowledge your strengths without being attacked, that you can accept praise without catastrophe following, that the people in your life now might actually be different from the people who taught you to hide. This doesn't happen all at once. You don't just decide to stop protecting yourself and suddenly feel safe being visible. It's a gradual process of taking small risks, of standing slightly taller and noticing that nothing terrible happens, of accepting a compliment and discovering that the world doesn't end, that people don't turn on you, that you survive the vulnerability of being seen. And slowly, with enough positive experiences, with enough evidence that visibility in this context is different from visibility in that old context, the protective strategy begins to relax. You begin to trust that maybe you can take up space. Maybe you can own your achievements. Maybe you can accept kind words without immediately having to make yourself small again. Maybe staying small was necessary once, but maybe, just maybe, it's safe to grow now. Here's something subtle that happens when you deflect compliments. You maintain control over how you're seen. If someone praises you and you accept it, you're agreeing to be seen through their eyes, to let their perception shape the narrative. But if you deflect, redirect, minimize, you get to control the story. You get to decide what's true about you rather than letting someone else's view potentially conflict with your own. This need for control often stems from early experiences of unpredictability. When your emotional world as a child was chaotic or inconsistent, you learned to control whatever you could, and sometimes that includes controlling how others perceive you, even if it means rejecting their kindness. Control becomes especially important when you grew up in an environment where you couldn't predict whether you'd be praised or criticized, loved or rejected, safe or in danger. When the adults around you were inconsistent, when their reactions to you seemed arbitrary or dependent on factors you couldn't understand or influence, you learned that the world is fundamentally unpredictable. And in the face of that unpredictability, the mind desperately searches for something it can control. If you can't control whether you'll be loved, maybe you can control expectations. If you can't control whether you'll be accepted, maybe you can control how much of yourself you reveal. If you can't control whether someone's perception of you will shift suddenly and painfully, maybe you can control that perception by managing it carefully, by never letting it get too positive, by keeping it aligned with your own understanding of yourself. This is where deflecting compliments becomes a control strategy. If you accept someone's positive perception of you, you're ceding control of the narrative. You're allowing their view to stand, to possibly conflict with your own self-concept, to create expectations you might not meet. But if you immediately correct them, redirect them, show them the flaws they're missing, you maintain control. You keep the narrative manageable. You prevent the destabilizing experience of having someone see you differently than you see yourself. And in a world that once felt chaotic and unpredictable, this control feels essential, feels like survival. But this control comes at a cost, because genuine connection requires a loosening of control. It requires allowing yourself to be seen as you are, not just as you think you should be seen. It requires tolerating the discomfort of someone's perception differing from your own without immediately needing to correct it. It requires trusting that you can handle the unpredictability of how others see you, that their shifting perceptions won't destroy you, that you're resilient enough to maintain your sense of self even when others' views of you change. And here's what often gets missed. The control you're maintaining isn't actually protecting you from unpredictability. It's creating a different kind of unpredictability. Because when you constantly deflect compliments, when you manage how others see you by always redirecting them toward your flaws, you create confusion in your relationships. People don't know what you actually think about yourself. They don't know whether you genuinely can't see your strengths or whether you're just being overly modest. They don't know if complimenting you will make you uncomfortable, or if you secretly want the acknowledgement but feel unable to accept it. The control strategy creates its own chaos in the relational field. What might feel more stable, ironically, is allowing some loss of control. Allowing people to see you as they see you, even when it doesn't perfectly match your self-concept. Allowing compliments to stand uncorrected, even when it creates some internal dissonance. Allowing yourself to be perceived as capable or kind or talented, even when you're not entirely sure that's accurate. This loss of control feels risky because it is risky. You're allowing unpredictability back into your emotional life. You're allowing other people's perceptions to exist alongside your own without immediately needing to manage or correct them. You're tolerating the discomfort of not knowing exactly how you're being seen, of not being able to precisely control the narrative about who you are. But this risk also creates possibility. The possibility of being surprised by how others see you, of discovering strengths you didn't know you had, of having your self-concept expanded by others' observations rather than constantly contracted by your own criticisms. The possibility of connection that's built on mutual perception rather than on your carefully managed presentation. The possibility of relaxing the exhausting vigilance that comes with constant control, and instead allowing yourself to be seen, truly seen, with all the vulnerability and possibility that entails. Deep down, many people who struggle with compliments are wrestling with a fundamental question. Are they being genuine, or are they just being nice? There's a hypervigilance that develops, a scanning for ulterior motives, for social obligation, for politeness masquerading as truth. You start analysing the compliment instead of receiving it. They have to say that because we're friends. They're just trying to make me feel better. They want something from me. This skepticism often comes from experiences where praise was conditional or manipulative, where kind words were followed by expectations or were used as a tool for control. Psychologists studying trust development have found that when early caregivers were inconsistent or used affection strategically, it creates lasting difficulty in trusting positive feedback. This hypervigilance is actually a sophisticated protective mechanism. Your psyche learned, through painful experience, that kind words don't always mean what they seem to mean. Maybe you had a parent who praised you lavishly in public but criticized you harshly in private. Maybe you experienced love bombing followed by devaluation. Maybe you learned that compliments were often followed by requests, by expectations, by the revelation that the kindness was transactional rather than genuine. So your nervous system developed a scanner, a way of immediately analysing positive feedback for hidden meanings, for strings attached, for the other shoe that's about to drop. And this scanner runs automatically now, even in contexts where it's not needed, even with people who are genuinely offering appreciation with no ulterior motive. Someone compliments your work and you immediately wonder what they want. Someone admires your appearance and you question their sincerity. Someone acknowledges your kindness and you assume they're just being polite. The scanner is so sensitive, so vigilant, that it can't distinguish between genuine and manipulative praise anymore. It treats all compliments as potentially dangerous, all positive feedback as possibly deceptive. This creates a particular kind of isolation, because when you can't trust that kind words are genuine, you can't let them nourish you. They slide off your armour, unabsorbed, leaving you still hungry for the validation you can't quite believe when it's offered. You end up in a painful double bind, desperately wanting to be seen and appreciated, but unable to trust the very appreciation you're seeking. The compliment arrives, and instead of feeling nourished, you feel suspicious. Instead of allowing connection, you're analysing for deception. Instead of simply receiving, you're interrogating. And what's particularly painful is that this skepticism is often accurate in detecting social niceties, the compliments that are more about politeness than genuine observation. But it's also hyperactive, seeing manipulation where there's only kindness, seeing obligation where there's genuine appreciation, seeing strategy where there's simple human warmth. The scanner can't calibrate anymore. It's been set to high alert for so long that it mistakes safety for danger, mistakes genuine care for potential threat. Healing this involves slowly learning to distinguish between contexts, between people, between the past and the present. It involves recognizing that just because praise was once used manipulatively doesn't mean all praise is manipulation. It involves building relationships with people who are consistently genuine, whose words match their actions, who offer appreciation without strings attached, and allowing those experiences to slowly recalibrate the scanner. It involves practicing tolerance for the uncertainty of not knowing for sure whether someone's being genuine, but choosing to receive their words as if they are, as an experiment, as a risk worth taking. And it involves developing enough internal stability that even if someone's compliment turns out to be manipulative, even if their kindness has strings attached, you can handle that disappointment without it confirming your worst fears about all human interaction. That you're resilient enough to survive occasional deception without needing to guard against all kindness. That you can risk believing people's positive words, knowing that sometimes you might be wrong, but that the cost of being occasionally wrong is less than the cost of never allowing yourself to be nourished by genuine appreciation when it's offered. Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, talked about the incongruence between the self-concept, how you see yourself, and the ideal self, who you think you should be. For many, people compliments highlight this gap in painful ways. Someone praises you for being kind, but you know the moments you are harsh. Someone admires your confidence, but you feel the anxiety beneath your smile. The compliment points to a quality you wish you had consistently, but know you only manage sometimes. And accepting the praise feels like accepting a lie because you're intensely aware of all the times you fall short of the person they think you are. This is the particular torture of self-awareness combined with harsh self-judgment. You have enough insight to see your own contradictions, your inconsistencies, the gap between your best self and your worst self. But you don't have the compassion to hold those contradictions gently, to recognize that being inconsistent is part of being human. So when someone compliments you on a quality you possess sometimes but not always, it highlights every time you fail to embody that quality. They say you're patient, and you immediately remember the moment yesterday when you snapped at someone. They say you're thoughtful, and you recall all the times you forgot to consider someone's feelings. They say you're brave, and you feel the weight of every time you chose safety over courage. The compliment becomes a spotlight on the gap between who you sometimes are and who you wish you always were. And that gap feels like evidence of inadequacy, like proof that you're fooling people, like confirmation that you're not actually the person they think you are. But here's what's missing in that assessment. Everyone has this gap. Everyone is sometimes kind and sometimes harsh. Everyone has moments of confidence and moments of anxiety. Everyone succeeds in embodying their value sometimes and falls short other times. The gap isn't evidence of your unique inadequacy. It's evidence of your humanity. Rogers talked about the goal of therapy as increasing congruence, bringing the self-concept closer to both the actual self and the ideal self, creating more alignment and less internal conflict. But he also understood that perfect congruence is impossible. We're all works in progress, all inconsistent, all containing multitudes that don't always align neatly. And psychological health isn't about eliminating the gap, it's about holding the gap with self-compassion, about recognizing that you can be genuinely kind even though you're sometimes harsh, that you can be authentically brave even though you're sometimes afraid. So when someone compliments you on being kind, they're not claiming you're perfectly kind in every moment. They're acknowledging that kindness is a quality you demonstrate, that they've experienced from you, that shows up in you enough to be noticeable and real. Accepting that compliment doesn't mean agreeing that you're flawlessly kind. It means acknowledging that yes, kindness is part of who you are, even though it's not the only part, even though you're sometimes other things too. It means allowing yourself to be seen in your goodness without that erasing your awareness of your limitations. But when you're caught in harsh self-judgment, when you're hyper-aware of every way you fail to live up to your ideals, this nuanced acceptance feels impossible. You think you have to be consistent to deserve acknowledgement. You think you have to embody a quality perfectly before you're allowed to claim it as part of yourself. You think accepting a compliment means declaring yourself to be always and entirely that thing, rather than sometimes and partially that thing. And so, the compliment feels false, feels dangerous, feels like an invitation to fraud, and you deflect it, and you return to your familiar internal criticism. and the gap between how others see you and how you see yourself grows wider, making the next compliment even harder to accept, and the cycle deepens. Breaking this cycle requires developing what Rogers called unconditional positive regard for yourself. It requires learning to hold your contradictions with compassion rather than judgment. It requires understanding that you can accept a compliment for something you did well in this moment without claiming you do it well in every moment. It requires allowing yourself to be seen and appreciated for your genuine qualities without that appreciation erasing your awareness of your very real limitations. It requires, ultimately, accepting that you're human, imperfect, inconsistent, and still, even so, genuinely worthy of the kind words being offered. There's a physiological response that happens when you receive a compliment, especially if you're not used to it. Your heart rate might increase. You might feel heat rising to your face. There's a flooding sensation, an intensity of emotion that feels overwhelming. For people who learned early in life to suppress their feelings, to stay regulated and controlled, this sudden surge of positive emotion can feel just as threatening as negative emotion. Emotion regulation difficulties, a concept central to dialectical behavior therapy developed by Marsha Linehan, can make all intense feelings, even joy and pride, feel unmanageable. So you deflect the compliment to avoid the overwhelm of actually feeling it. This might seem counterintuitive. Why would positive emotion feel threatening? But for people who grew up in environments where emotions were dangerous, where showing feeling led to punishment or dismissal or being taken advantage of, the nervous system learns to treat all emotional intensity as a threat. It doesn't distinguish between positive and negative intensity. It just recognizes intensity, and intensity means danger. So when a compliment creates a swell of warmth, or pride, or joy, the nervous system responds as if you're in danger. Your heart races not from pleasure but from alarm. The heat in your face feels like exposure, like being too visible. The emotion feels like it might overwhelm your capacity to contain it, might crack the careful control you've maintained over your internal experience. And so you shut it down. You deflect the compliment, you minimize it, you redirect it, anything to make the intensity subside, to return to the more manageable state of emotional numbness or low-level negative affect that feels safer because it's familiar. The deflection isn't about modesty, it's about emotional survival. It's about managing a nervous system that learned that feeling too much of anything is dangerous. This pattern is particularly common in people who experienced emotional neglect or invalidation in childhood, where their feelings were consistently dismissed, minimized, or punished. If you learned that expressing joy made you a target for mockery, that showing pride was arrogant, that displaying excitement meant you'd be disappointed, then your nervous system developed a protective strategy. Stay numb, stay controlled. Don't let yourself feel too much of anything, because feeling leads to pain. And this strategy worked as a child. It protected you from the additional pain of having your feelings weaponized against you. But as an adult, this same protective numbness keeps you disconnected from the nourishment of positive emotion. When someone compliments you, and you feel a surge of warmth, of mattering, of being seen, your nervous system treats that surge as a threat and mobilizes to shut it down. You don't get to enjoy the feeling. You don't get to savor the moment of being appreciated. You have to manage the intensity, regulate it down to something more tolerable, which usually means not feeling it at all. Healing this involves learning that emotions, even intense positive ones, are safe, that you can feel joy without catastrophe following, that you can allow yourself to feel pride without being punished for it, that your nervous system can handle the intensity of positive feeling without falling apart. This is delicate work, often requiring therapeutic support, because you're essentially teaching your body that something it learned was dangerous is actually safe. You're recalibrating a threat detection system that's been set to high sensitivity for years, maybe decades. And this recalibration happens through small, repeated experiences of allowing yourself to feel positive emotion and surviving it. Maybe you start by just noticing when a compliment creates physical sensations, noticing the warmth, the racing heart, the flush, without immediately needing to make it stop. Then maybe you practice breathing through it, staying with the sensation for just a moment longer before deflecting. Then maybe you try actually saying thank you while your nervous system is still activated, while you're still feeling the intensity, teaching your body that you can receive kindness even in the midst of emotional arousal. Gradually, with enough positive experiences, your nervous system begins to learn that this particular kind of intensity is safe, is nourishing, is something you can allow yourself to feel fully without danger. Social anxiety isn't just about fear of judgment or criticism. It's also about an intense self-consciousness that makes any kind of attention feel uncomfortable. When someone compliments you, suddenly you're the center of focus. Eyes are on you. You're expected to respond. And for someone with social anxiety, this creates acute discomfort. Cognitive behavioral models of social anxiety show that people with this condition often have an overly critical observer perspective, constantly monitoring how they appear to others and assuming the worst. A compliment forces you into the spotlight, and when you believe everyone is scrutinizing you for flaws, being praised feels paradoxically dangerous because it draws more attention. The logic of social anxiety goes something like this: if I'm invisible, I'm safe. If people aren't noticing me, they aren't judging me. But a compliment breaks that invisibility. It means someone has been paying attention, has formed an opinion, is now sharing that opinion publicly. And even though the opinion is positive, the attention itself feels threatening. Because now you're visible, now you have to respond, now everyone is watching to see how you handle this moment. And social anxiety convinces you that you're going to handle it wrong, that you're going to say something awkward, that your discomfort is going to be visible, and will become further evidence of your social inadequacy. So you rush through the moment, you deflect as quickly as possible, you minimize the compliment to minimize the attention, to return to the safer state of invisibility. The deflection isn't really about the content of the compliment. It's about managing the spotlight, about getting out from under the gaze of others as quickly as possible. And this makes sense within the framework of social anxiety, where the core fear is being negatively evaluated by others. A compliment might be positive evaluation, but it's still evaluation, still attention, still a moment of being seen, and being seen means being vulnerable to judgment. What makes this particularly difficult is that deflecting compliments often increases the attention rather than decreasing it. When someone compliments you and you immediately deflect, they might insist, they might elaborate, they might try to convince you of the truth of their words. So now the moment you were trying to shorten has extended. The spotlight you were trying to escape has intensified, and your anxiety increases, which makes you deflect more strongly, which might make them insist more firmly, and the interaction spirals into exactly the kind of prolonged social focus you were desperately trying to avoid. This is where understanding the mechanism can help. If the deflection is about managing attention rather than about genuinely disagreeing with the compliment, then sometimes the most effective response is counterintuitive. Accept it quickly and simply. A brief "thank you" often ends the interaction much faster than deflection and explanation. It satisfies the social exchange without prolonging it, without inviting further elaboration, without drawing more attention. But this requires overriding the anxious impulse to minimize and explain, which takes practice and often therapeutic support. And it requires challenging the core beliefs that fuel social anxiety. The belief that people are constantly judging you, that they're noticing every flaw, that they're forming harsh opinions about your adequacy. Because when you hold these beliefs, a compliment feels incongruent with reality. It feels like either they're lying to be polite, or they haven't noticed your flaws yet, or they're setting you up for later judgment. The compliment can't be accepted as genuine because your model of social reality doesn't allow for the possibility that people might see you positively, might appreciate you genuinely, might notice your strengths more than your weaknesses. Cognitive behavioral therapy for social anxiety works on identifying and challenging these distorted beliefs, on gathering evidence that contradicts the anxious narrative, on building a more balanced understanding of how others actually perceive you. And part of that work involves practicing receiving compliments, using them as data points that maybe, just maybe, people's perceptions of you are less harsh than you imagine, that you're allowed to take up space, that being seen doesn't necessarily mean being judged negatively, that visibility might sometimes feel uncomfortable, but isn't actually dangerous. Perfectionism isn't about doing things well, it's about never doing them well enough. And when you hold yourself to impossible standards, compliments feel misplaced because you're always focused on what you didn't achieve, what you could have done better, what's still imperfect. Psychologists distinguish between healthy striving and perfectionism. Healthy striving is self-directed, focuses on growth, and allows for mistakes. Perfectionism is fear-driven, concerned with others' approval and terrified of failure. When you're caught in perfectionism, praise for doing something well doesn't land because you're already cataloguing the 47 ways it wasn't perfect. Research by psychologist Thomas Greenspon suggests that perfectionism often develops as a response to conditional acceptance in childhood. If your worth as a child felt dependent on your achievements, if love seemed to be granted based on performance, then you learned that perfect is the only safe place to be. Because perfect means lovable. Perfect means accepted. Perfect means protected from criticism or rejection or disappointment. And so you developed impossibly high standards, not because you genuinely want to excel in everything, but because anything less than perfect feels existentially threatening. It feels like you'll lose love, lose value, lose your right to exist in people's good graces. This means the compliments, which acknowledge good but not perfect performance, feel like traps. If you accept the compliment, you're accepting that this imperfect work is worthy of praise. But that contradicts the core belief that only perfection is acceptable. So you have to deflect it, have to point out the flaws, have to make sure everyone knows that you're aware this wasn't perfect, that you haven't mistaken good for good enough. The deflection is a way of maintaining your standards, of refusing to accept less than perfect, even when others are willing to celebrate something imperfect. And there's a particular exhaustion that comes with perfectionism. Because perfect is unattainable, there's always something that could have been better. Always a flaw you can find if you look closely enough. Always a gap between what you achieved and what you imagine you should have achieved. So you never get to rest. You never get to feel satisfied. You never get to enjoy your accomplishments because they're never quite perfect enough to deserve enjoyment. And compliments, instead of providing the relief of external validation, just highlight the gap. They show you that others have a lower standard than you do, that they're satisfied with something you know is imperfect, that they're seeing the work rather than all the ways it falls short. This creates a lonely existence, because you're operating by rules that no one else even knows about, holding yourself to standards that would be impossible for anyone to meet, judging yourself by criteria that ensure you'll always fall short. And when people try to reach you with appreciation, with acknowledgement of your genuine accomplishments, their words can't penetrate the perfectionism. They bounce off, irrelevant, because they're addressing a different reality than the one you're living in. They're celebrating what you did. You're mourning what you didn't. Breaking free from perfectionism doesn't mean lowering your standards to the point of mediocrity. It means distinguishing between excellence and perfection. Excellence is achievable, contextualized, allows for human limitation. Perfection is impossible, absolute, allows for no error. Excellence lets you feel good about doing something well while still seeing room for growth. Perfection requires flawlessness, or else everything is failure. And learning to accept compliments is part of the process of releasing perfectionism, because it means allowing yourself to be appreciated for something imperfect, allowing yourself to acknowledge that good enough is sometimes actually good enough, that you can be worthy of praise even when your work isn't flawless. This requires immense self-compassion and often therapeutic support, because perfectionism is usually defended fiercely. It feels like the perfectionism is what keeps you safe, what makes you valuable, what protects you from the catastrophe of being ordinary or mediocre or inadequate. But slowly, through gentle challenge and compassionate support, you can begin to see that the perfectionism isn't protecting you. It's imprisoning you. It's keeping you from ever feeling satisfied, ever feeling worthy, ever being able to receive the love and appreciation that people want to offer you. And that maybe, just maybe, you could be valued, could be loved, could be enough, even in your beautiful, messy, imperfect humanity. There's a psychological concept called cognitive consistency theory, the idea that humans have a deep need for their beliefs, attitudes and perceptions to align with each other. If you've spent years, maybe decades, believing you're not particularly talented, not especially attractive, not remarkably capable, then a compliment that contradicts this self-concept creates psychological tension. It's easier to reject the new information, to deflect the compliment, than to reorganize your entire understanding of yourself. This is why negative self-beliefs are so persistent. They've become part of your identity's architecture, and every compliment that challenges them gets treated like a glitch in the system rather than valuable data. This need for consistency is powerful because inconsistency creates what psychologist Leon Festinger called cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable mental state that arises when you hold contradictory beliefs or when new information conflicts with existing beliefs. And the mind will go to great lengths to resolve this dissonance, usually by rejecting or reinterpreting the new information rather than revising the old belief. Because the old belief, even if it's negative, is familiar. It's integrated into your sense of self. It's predictable. Changing it would require reorganizing not just one belief, but an entire network of related beliefs about yourself, your worth, your place in the world. So when someone compliments you, and that compliment contradicts your self-concept, you experience dissonance. They say you're talented. You believe you're mediocre. These two pieces of information can't both be true, and the mind has several options for resolving this. You could change your belief about yourself to align with the compliment, but that's difficult, destabilizing, requires wholesale revision of your identity. Or you could dismiss the compliment. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're being nice. Maybe they don't know you well enough to make an accurate assessment. This is easier. This preserves your existing self-concept. This resolves the dissonance by rejecting the new information. And the more entrenched your negative self-belief, the more easily you'll reject positive feedback. If you've believed for 30 years that you're not creative, then one compliment about your creativity isn't going to overturn 3 decades of self-concept. It's going to be dismissed as an anomaly, as the other person being mistaken, as not quite applying to you even though they thought it did. The belief stays intact. The compliment is rejected. Consistency is maintained. This is why changing self-concept often requires more than just receiving positive feedback. It requires actively working to create dissonance, to notice when your beliefs about yourself don't match reality, to collect evidence that contradicts your negative self-concept, and force yourself to integrate it rather than dismiss it. It requires therapy, or journaling, or trusted relationships where people consistently reflect back a more positive and accurate view of you than you hold of yourself. It requires deliberately choosing to believe the compliment instead of the old story, even when the old story feels more true because it's more familiar. And it requires recognizing that identity isn't fixed. You're not locked into the self-concept you formed in childhood or adolescence or early adulthood. You can revise your understanding of yourself based on new information, new experiences, new reflections from others. But that revision requires tolerating the discomfort of inconsistency, of holding multiple beliefs about yourself simultaneously, of not quite knowing which is true, while you slowly integrate a more complex, more accurate, more compassionate understanding of who you are. This process is gradual. You don't just decide one day to accept compliments, and suddenly your self-concept shifts. You practice. You notice when you're deflecting. You catch the automatic rejection of positive feedback. You challenge it. You ask yourself, what if they're right? What if I am actually capable, or kind, or talented, at least sometimes in some ways? You let the compliment sit alongside your doubt without immediately needing to resolve the tension. And over time, with enough accumulated evidence, with enough willingness to tolerate the discomfort of believing something new about yourself, this self-concept begins to shift, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And compliments begin to land differently, not as threats to your identity, but as data points that help you understand yourself more fully, more accurately, more kindly. Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, extensively studied defense mechanisms, the unconscious psychological strategies we use to protect ourselves from anxiety and emotional pain. Deflecting compliments can be understood as a defense mechanism, specifically one called minimization, or sometimes intellectualization. By immediately reducing the significance of praise or by analyzing it rather than feeling it, You protect yourself from the vulnerability of accepting that you might actually be worthy of the kind words. These defenses aren't conscious choices. They're automatic responses your psyche developed to keep you safe from perceived threats, even when those threats are actually gifts. Defense mechanisms serve a function. They protect us from overwhelming anxiety, from unbearable emotional pain, from realities we're not yet equipped to face, and in that sense they're intelligent adaptations, but they also have costs. They keep us safe by keeping us isolated, by preventing genuine connection, by blocking us from experiencing the full range of human emotion, including joy, pride, and the warmth of being appreciated. When you automatically deflect compliments, you're defending against the vulnerability of receiving love, of being seen, of mattering to someone. And that defense protects you from potential disappointment or the pain of later losing that positive regard. But it also ensures you never get to experience the nourishment of being genuinely appreciated. The particular defense of intellectualization, analyzing the compliment rather than feeling it, allows you to engage with the words at a cognitive level while remaining emotionally protected. You can think about whether the compliment is accurate, what the person's motives might be, how it compares to your self-assessment, all without actually feeling the warmth of being appreciated. You stay in your head, in the realm of analysis and evaluation, rather than dropping into your body, into your heart, where you might actually feel moved by someone's kind words. Minimization works similarly. By immediately reducing the significance of what you did, you reduce the emotional weight of the compliment. It was nothing means you don't have to feel the pride of achievement. Anyone could have done it means you don't have to feel special or valued. I just got lucky means you don't have to feel the vulnerability of being seen as capable. The minimization keeps everything manageable, keeps the emotional stakes low, keeps you protected from the risk of believing you matter and then potentially being devastated if that belief is later challenged. But here's what happens over time when these defenses run automatically. You lose touch with your own emotional reality. You become so practiced at deflecting, minimizing, analyzing, that you genuinely stop knowing how you feel about yourself, what you're good at, what impact you have on others. The defenses that were meant to protect you end up disconnecting you from yourself, from others, from the possibility of genuine pride or satisfaction, or the simple pleasure of being appreciated. Psychodynamic therapy often works with defense mechanisms, not by trying to eliminate them, but by bringing them into consciousness, by helping you understand what you're protecting yourself from, and whether that protection is still necessary. Maybe the deflection made perfect sense when you were a child, and praise was followed by painful expectations or was withdrawn capriciously. But maybe now, in adult relationships with people who offer appreciation genuinely and consistently, the defense is outdated. Maybe the threat it's protecting against isn't actually present anymore. And maybe, with support and practice, you can slowly begin to lower the defense, to allow compliments to land, to risk the vulnerability of accepting that you might be worthy of the kind words being offered. This doesn't mean the defense goes away entirely. Defense mechanisms are deeply ingrained, and they often serve us well in some contexts. But it means developing the capacity to choose, to notice when the defense is activating, and to consciously decide whether it's needed in this moment, with this person, in this context. To practice sometimes saying thank you instead of deflecting, and noticing that you survive the vulnerability, that nothing catastrophic happens, that you can hold someone's positive regard without falling apart. And slowly, gradually, the defense loosens its grip, and you begin to develop new ways of relating to compliments, to appreciation, to the possibility of being seen and valued for who you are. The stories you tell yourself about who you are were written over many years, in many moments, by many voices, and these stories are powerful because they become self-fulfilling. If you believe you're not creative, you won't pursue creative endeavors. If you believe you're not likable, you'll interpret social interactions through that lens. Cognitive therapy, pioneered by Aaron Beck, operates on the principle that our thoughts shape our emotions and behaviors. When you can't accept compliments, you're maintaining an old narrative that may have been formed in childhood, reinforced through difficult experiences, and now runs automatically in the background of your mind. But here's what's both challenging and hopeful. Narratives can be rewritten. The narrative you carry about yourself isn't objective truth. It's a story constructed from selective memory, interpreted through whatever lens was available when the story was first forming. Maybe the story says you're not good enough. Where did that come from? Was it a parent's criticism, a teacher's dismissal, a peer's cruelty, a series of failures that you interpreted as evidence of your fundamental inadequacy? The story feels true because you've been telling it to yourself for so long, because you've filtered all subsequent experiences through it, because it's shaped your choices and therefore shaped your life in ways that seem to confirm it. But what if the story is based on incomplete information? What if the parent who criticized you was dealing with their own pain and projected it onto you? What if the teacher who dismissed you was burned out and failed to see your potential? What if the failures you experienced were normal, human, part of learning, and not evidence of your inadequacy? What if the story you've been telling yourself about yourself is less about who you actually are and more about who you were taught to believe you are? Cognitive therapy teaches that you can identify the automatic thoughts that maintain these narratives, challenge them with evidence, and gradually construct new, more accurate stories about yourself. And compliments are actually valuable data for this rewriting process. When someone compliments you and you automatically deflect, that's a moment to pause. What thought just ran through your mind? They don't really mean it. They're just being nice. They haven't seen my flaws. These are automatic thoughts, part of the old narrative, and you can challenge them. What's the evidence that they don't mean it? What if they do mean it, and your disbelief is the distortion? What if their compliment is actually more accurate than your negative self-assessment? This cognitive work is slow and requires repetition. You don't just challenge a thought once and have the narrative instantly rewrite itself. You have to keep practicing, keep noticing the automatic negative thoughts, keep challenging them with evidence and alternative interpretations, keep choosing to believe the compliment instead of the criticism. And gradually, over time, the narrative begins to shift. The old story loses its automatic quality. You start to notice when you're telling yourself you're not good enough, and you can pause and you can ask, is that actually true? Or is that just the old story? And new stories begin to emerge. Stories based on actual evidence rather than old wounds. Stories that acknowledge both your strengths and your limitations. Stories that allow for complexity, for growth, for the reality that you're neither as terrible as your harshest critic claims, nor as perfect as your most idealized self wishes you were. Stories that make room for you to receive a compliment without it contradicting your entire sense of self. Because your sense of self has become flexible enough to include the possibility that, yes, sometimes you do things well, sometimes you are kind, sometimes you make a positive impact, and that's allowed to be true even if you're also sometimes struggling, sometimes imperfect, sometimes still learning. This narrative rewriting is liberating because it means you're not trapped in the story you were given or the story you constructed in response to early pain. You can author a new story. You can decide what to believe about yourself based on current evidence rather than old wounds. And you can use compliments as opportunities to add new chapters, new plot points, new characterizations that are more generous, more accurate, more aligned with who you actually are rather than who you were once told you were, or who you once feared you were. The rewriting is challenging, but it's possible, and it begins with the simple, revolutionary act of listening when someone sees something good in you, and choosing to consider that maybe, just maybe, they're right. Kristin Neff, the leading researcher on self-compassion, describes it as treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a good friend. It involves 3 core components: self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, and mindful awareness versus over-identification with difficult emotions. When you struggle to accept compliments, you're often lacking in self-compassion. You hold yourself to standards you'd never impose on others. You beat yourself up for imperfections everyone has. You isolate in your sense of inadequacy instead of recognizing that struggle is part of the shared human experience. Learning to accept compliments is, in many ways, learning to extend compassion to yourself, to allow that you might be worthy of the kindness others want to offer. Think about how you respond when a friend deflects a compliment you've given them. You probably feel a mixture of frustration and compassion. You want them to see what you see. You want them to accept that they did something worthy of acknowledgement. You wouldn't judge them for accepting your praise. You wouldn't think they were arrogant for saying thank you. So why do you hold yourself to a different standard? Why is it okay for them to be imperfect and still deserving of appreciation, but not okay for you? This double standard is at the heart of the self-compassion deficit. You extend understanding, forgiveness, and kindness to others while withholding it from yourself. When others make mistakes, you see them as human. When you make mistakes, you see them as evidence of your inadequacy. When others succeed, you celebrate them. When you succeed, you minimize it. The harshness you direct at yourself would horrify you if you witnessed someone else treating a friend that way. But you've internalized it so deeply that it feels normal, feels deserved, feels like you're just being realistic rather than being cruel. Self-compassion asks you to notice this cruelty and choose differently. It asks you to speak to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you love. When you deflect a compliment, self-compassion invites you to pause and ask, if my friend had just done what I did and received this compliment, what would I want them to do? How would I want them to respond? And the answer is usually clear. You'd want them to receive it, to let it in, to allow themselves to feel good about what they accomplished. So self-compassion asks you to offer yourself that same grace. The common humanity aspect of self-compassion is particularly relevant to accepting compliments. When you can't receive praise, you're often feeling isolated in your perceived inadequacy. You believe you're uniquely flawed, uniquely struggling, uniquely undeserving. But everyone struggles. Everyone has imperfections. Everyone falls short of their ideals sometimes. The difference is that some people have learned to hold their imperfections with compassion, while still recognizing their strengths. They understand that being imperfect doesn't mean being worthless, that having limitations doesn't mean having no value, that struggling in some areas doesn't negate accomplishment in others. When you practice self-compassion, receiving a compliment becomes less about whether you deserve it based on some objective measure of perfection, and more about simply being human, being seen, being appreciated for whatever you offered in that moment. It becomes okay to be praised for being kind, even though you're sometimes harsh, because everyone is sometimes harsh. It becomes okay to be acknowledged for doing something well, even though you've done things poorly, because everyone has done things poorly. Your worth isn't contingent on being perfect. It's inherent in your humanity, and self-compassion helps you remember that. The mindful awareness component means noticing your thoughts and feelings without being consumed by them. When you receive a compliment and immediately feel discomfort, shame, or the urge to deflect, mindfulness invites you to notice those reactions without automatically acting on them. You can observe, I'm feeling uncomfortable. I'm having the thought that I don't deserve this. I'm noticing the impulse to minimize what I did. And in that observation, there's tiny space of freedom. A space where you can choose how to respond rather than just reacting automatically. This space is where change happens. In that pause between stimulus and response, you can practice self-compassion. You can acknowledge that it's hard to accept compliments, that this discomfort makes sense given your history, that you're not alone in this struggle, and then you can gently choose a different response. Maybe you say thank you, even though it feels awkward. Maybe you let yourself feel a moment of pride, even though it's uncomfortable. Maybe you practice believing the compliment instead of immediately discounting it. The practice is gentle, compassionate, acknowledging the difficulty while still moving towards something healthier, something more nourishing, something that allows you to receive the love and appreciation that people genuinely want to offer. There's a somatic, physical dimension to accepting compliments that often gets overlooked. Notice what happens in your body when someone praises you. Does your chest tighten? Do your shoulders rise? Does your stomach clench? Do you hold your breath? These physical responses are your nervous system's way of managing the experience. Somatic psychology and trauma therapy, particularly the work of people like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk, emphasize that healing isn't just cognitive, it's embodied. Learning to accept compliments might involve learning to breathe through the discomfort, to feel your feet on the ground, to notice the impulse to deflect and choose, just for a moment, to stay present with the kind words instead. Your body holds memory in ways that your conscious mind doesn't. The tightening in your chest when someone compliments you might be connected to a time when praise was followed by pain, when being seen positively meant becoming a target, when visibility felt dangerous. Your shoulders rising might be a protective response, literally armoring your vital organs against perceived threat. Your breath holding might be a freeze response, your nervous system's way of staying very still in the face of danger. These aren't conscious choices, they're autonomic responses, your body trying to keep you safe based on what it learned was necessary in the past. And because these responses are held in the body, cognitive work alone often isn't enough to change them. You can rationally understand that compliments are safe, that this person genuinely appreciates you, that there's no danger in this moment. But your body might still respond as if there is danger, because the body's memory is older, deeper, more primitive than your rational understanding. So working with the body, learning to recognize and gradually shift these somatic responses, becomes an essential part of learning to receive compliments. Somatic practices might include grounding exercises, feeling your feet firmly on the floor when someone compliments you, reminding your nervous system that you're safe and stable. They might include breath work, deliberately taking slow, deep breaths instead of holding your breath, signaling to your body that there's no threat. They might include gentle movement, releasing the tension in your shoulders or unclenching your jaw, physically softening the armor your body automatically raises. And they might include what Peter Levine calls pendulation, gently moving your attention between the discomfort of receiving the compliment and a sense of safety or pleasantness elsewhere in your body or environment. You feel the tightness in your chest, and then you notice the comfortable weight of your body in the chair. You feel the heat of embarrassment in your face, and then you notice the coolness of the air on your skin. You pendulate back and forth, teaching your nervous system that you can hold both the discomfort and the safety, that you don't have to be completely consumed by the discomfort, that there are resources available even in the midst of difficulty. Bessel van der Kolk's work emphasizes that trauma lives in the body, and that healing trauma requires addressing the body's responses, not just the mind's narratives. If your difficulty with compliments is rooted in early experiences of being hurt, when visible, when praised, when seen, then those experiences are stored in your body's memory. And learning to accept compliments means helping your body learn that it's safe now, that praise in this context is different from praise in that old context, that you can be visible without being violated, appreciated without being exploited. This embodied work is slow and gentle. You're not trying to force your body to feel differently. You're trying to create new experiences, new associations, new somatic memories of receiving kindness without pain following. You practice staying present in your body when someone compliments you. You practice breathing. You practice softening. You notice when your body wants to armor up, and you gently remind it that you're safe. And over time, with enough repetitions, your body begins to learn a new response. The compliment still creates sensation, but the sensation shifts from threat to warmth, from danger to connection, from something to defend against to something you can actually receive. Your brain is remarkably plastic, meaning it can change throughout your life based on your experiences and practices. Every time you've deflected a compliment, you've strengthened a neural pathway that says, when praised, deflect. But neuroscience research shows that you can build new pathways. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but through consistent practice, you can train your brain to respond differently. This is the principle behind cognitive behavioral therapy and many other therapeutic approaches. When you intentionally practice receiving compliments, even if it feels awkward at first, even if you have to consciously override the impulse to deflect, you're literally reshaping your brain. You're teaching your nervous system that it's safe to be seen positively, that you can hold kindness without collapsing under the weight of it. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections, and this ability doesn't diminish as you age. You can teach an old brain new tricks, but it requires deliberate, repeated practice. One-time efforts don't create lasting change. You need repetition, consistency, intention. Every time you practice a new behavior, you're sending signals along a new neural pathway. At first, that pathway is weak, barely formed, easily overridden by the old, well-worn pathway of deflection. But with each repetition, the new pathway gets a little stronger, the connection gets a little more efficient. And eventually, with enough practice, the new pathway can become as automatic as the old one was. This means that learning to accept compliments is literally a process of brain retraining. You're not trying to convince yourself of something that isn't true. You're creating new neural architecture that allows truth to land differently. When someone compliments you and you practice saying thank you instead of deflecting, you're building the neural pathway for receiving. When you practice letting yourself feel a moment of pride instead of immediately criticizing yourself, you're strengthening the connection between achievement and positive emotion. When you practice believing the compliment instead of dismissing it, you're creating new associations between being praised and feeling worthy. The key is consistency and gentleness. You can't force neuroplasticity. You can't berate your brain into changing. You have to work with it, patiently, repeatedly, compassionately. And you have to expect that it will be uncomfortable at first. The old pathway of deflection is well established, efficient, automatic. It requires no effort. The new pathway of receiving requires conscious effort, deliberate choice, willingness to tolerate discomfort. Your brain will want to revert to the old pathway because it's easier. So you have to gently, persistently redirect it to the new one. And you have to celebrate small wins. The first time you say thank you instead of deflecting, that's a neural victory. The first time you let yourself feel proud for a moment before the criticism comes in, that's progress. The first time you notice the impulse to minimize and choose to pause instead, that's growth. These might seem like tiny changes, insignificant in the grand scheme of your lifelong pattern of deflecting compliments. But from a neuroplasticity perspective, they're enormous. They're evidence that the new pathway is forming, that change is possible, that your brain is learning a different way of responding. Over time, with consistent practice, what was once effortful becomes easier. The pause before deflecting becomes longer. The deflection becomes less automatic. Sometimes you even accept a compliment without thinking about it, and only afterwards do you realize, wait, I didn't deflect that time. These moments are evidence that the new pathway is strengthening, that your brain is rewiring, that you're genuinely changing your relationship with praise and with yourself. And this is hopeful, because it means you're not stuck. You're not doomed to deflect compliments forever. You can learn a new way. It takes time, takes practice, takes patience. But it's possible. Your brain can change, and so can you. There's a quiet strength that emerges when you learn to accept compliments with grace, not with arrogance or inflation, but with simple, honest acknowledgement. Thank you becomes an act of courage. Allowing yourself to feel pride becomes a form of self-respect. Recognizing your own worth becomes the foundation for genuine confidence, not the fragile kind that needs constant external validation, but the steady kind that comes from truly knowing yourself, including your strengths. This doesn't mean you become someone who needs praise or constantly seeks it. It means you become someone who can receive it when it's offered, who can hold both your imperfections and your capabilities in the same gentle hand, who understands that being human means being complex, flawed, and still fundamentally worthy of kindness, including from yourself. This strength isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't need to prove anything. It's the quiet confidence that comes from having faced your own resistance to being seen and choosing to soften it anyway. From having recognized the old protective patterns and deciding they no longer serve you. From having practiced, again and again, the vulnerable act of letting kind words land instead of bouncing them away. It's a strength built from 1,000 small moments of choosing to receive instead of deflect, choosing to believe instead of doubt, choosing to hold space for the possibility that you are worthy of the appreciation being offered. And this strength changes your relationships. When you can receive compliments, you're allowing people to give to you. You're accepting their gift of acknowledgement, their attempt at connection, their genuine appreciation. And that creates a reciprocity, a flow, a mutual seeing and being seen that builds intimacy and trust. People feel closer to you when you let them appreciate you, when you don't immediately push away their kind words, when you allow them to express what they value about you. The wall between you and them softens. Connection becomes possible in ways it wasn't when you were constantly armoured against positive regard, and this strength changes your relationship with yourself. When you can acknowledge your own strengths without shame or discomfort, you develop a more integrated sense of self. You're no longer fragmenting yourself into only the parts that need improvement, only the failures, only the inadequacies. You can hold the whole picture, the things you're good at and the things you struggle with, the ways you've grown and the ways you're still learning, the moments you showed up beautifully and the moments you fell short. All of it, all of you, complex, contradictory, imperfect, and still worthy of kindness, still deserving of acknowledgement, still fundamentally enough. This is the strength that comes from self-acceptance, not self-aggrandizement, not narcissism, not an inflated sense of your own importance, just a simple, grounded knowing that you are valuable exactly as you are, that you don't have to earn your worth through perfect performance, that you can be seen in your goodness without it erasing your awareness of your limitations, that you can receive appreciation without it obligating you to be more than you are. You can just be imperfect and worthy, flawed and valuable, still growing and already enough. And when you know this, when you truly embody this, compliments stop being threats. They become what they were always meant to be. Simple moments of human connection, one person seeing something good in another and wanting to acknowledge it. And you can receive that acknowledgement, breathe it in, let it nourish you, and say with genuine ease, "Thank you." Not because you need the validation to feel worthy, but because you can accept the gift of being seen, of mattering, of having made a difference in someone else's experience. And that acceptance, that receiving, that simple thank you is one of the most revolutionary acts of self-love you can practice. And so you've travelled through this landscape tonight, through the quiet territory of your own patterns, your own protection, your own complexity. You've looked at the ways you learn to deflect kindness, and you've begun to see that deflection not as a failure, but as an adaptation, an intelligence, a way of surviving in a world that didn't always feel safe enough to hold you in your goodness. You've explored the roots of this pattern, the psychology underneath it, the body's wisdom and the body's pain, the old stories and the possibility of new ones. And maybe, in this exploration, you've found some compassion for yourself, some understanding of why receiving a compliment has felt so impossibly difficult, and some gentle hope that maybe, with practice and patience, it could become a little easier. You're not broken for struggling with this. You are human. You are someone who learned early lessons about worth and visibility and safety, and you've been operating under those lessons for a long time, even when they no longer serve you, even when they keep you from receiving the very love and appreciation you most need. And that's not your fault. That's not failure. That's just what happens when we're shaped by experiences we didn't choose, when we develop protections we needed once but no longer need now. You're allowed to be imperfect and still worthy of praise. You're allowed to have flaws and still be valued. You're allowed to be still learning, still growing, still figuring it out, and still deserving of the kindness others want to offer you. Your worth is not contingent on being perfect. It's inherent in your humanity, and the compliments people give you, they're not asking you to be flawless. They're just acknowledging something true. They see in you something good, something that mattered to them. And you can receive that. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not easily, but you can practice, you can try, you can soften just a little and let one kind word land instead of bouncing it away. And tonight, as you settle into rest, you can let all of this be exactly as it is. You can release the effort of protecting yourself from kindness. You can soften the armor just for these quiet hours. You can allow yourself to rest in the simple truth that you are worthy exactly as you are, that you don't have to defend against appreciation, that you can be seen and be safe, that you can matter to others without that mattering destroying you. You can just be here, breathing, resting, letting yourself settle into the knowing that you're enough. You've always been enough. And all those compliments you deflected, all those kind words you pushed away, they were true. They saw something real. And maybe tomorrow or the next day or someday soon, you'll be ready to let one in, to breathe it in, to believe it, even just for a moment. But for now, you can simply rest. You can let yourself drift into sleep knowing you're held, you're seen, you're valued. Not for what you achieve or how well you perform or how perfectly you show up, but simply for being you. Complex, imperfect, still learning, still growing, and utterly, completely worthy of kindness. Let yourself soften into that truth now. Let yourself release into sleep. You're safe here. You're enough here. You can rest. And in the morning, whenever that comes, you'll still be worthy, still valuable, still deserving of every kind word anyone has ever offered you. Sleep now. Let it all go. You're exactly where you need to be. You're exactly who you need to be. And that's more than enough. Rest well.